Good evening. Welcome to a People for Effective Government online event. I'm PEG board member Dave Wilson, and I'll be co-moderating tonight's event along with another PEG board member, Chris Venn. PEG is a nonprofit Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Its mission is to support approaches to governing which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've held in-person public forums and online events like this one for over 3.5 years. PEG works to encourage sincere and civil discussions on the challenges that face our nation and seeks to promote effective solutions to those challenges by presenting public forums on a variety of relevant topics. As a reminder, the views presented by tonight's guest speaker are his own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in political activity of any kind. Our audience is welcome to submit brief questions at any time via the Q&A feature. Please limit your questions to 2 or 3 sentences. You are also welcome to ask several questions, but please submit only one question at a time. Our speaker will answer as many questions as possible before we end the forum around 8:30. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted on our website, pegnow.org, near the end of the month. The topic of tonight's forum is Understanding the New Inflation Environment, and our speaker is Dr. Grant Forsyth. Dr. Forsyth's presentation will focus on addressing questions regarding the reemergence of inflation in the U.S. and global economies. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Forsyth, who is a well-respected economist in Spokane and in our region. When local and regional leaders went to look at economic trends and economic forecasts, they turned to Dr. Forsyth. Dr. Forsyth is the chief economist at Avista Corporation. Before coming to Avista in 2012, he was a professor of economics at Eastern Washington University from 1999 to 2012. Before Eastern, from 1996 to 1999, he worked in the Czech Republic as an academic and private sector economist. He received his BA in economics from Central Washington University, his MBA in finance from the University of Oregon, and his PhD in economics from WSU. He also serves on the Washington Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, the Citizens Commission for the Performance Measurement of Tax Preferences, and the Spokane Mayor's Economic Advisory Roundtable. Dr. Forsyth, welcome back to PEG. The forum podium is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I am going to attempt to share my screen here. And one second. There, so hopefully everybody can see that. So as Dave mentioned, the presentation tonight is really going to look at what I call the new inflation environment. For those of us who are more mature, we remember the old inflation environment of the 70s and 80s, but it has really been an extremely long time since we've seen these types of inflationary pressures. We have at least one full generation of millennials, and of course, maybe 2 full generations if you include the Z's, that have never really experienced this kind of environment. But it's useful to recognize that what's happening now is perhaps a little bit different than what had happened back in the 70s and 80s, but the discomfort it's causing is very similar. So the first thing I want to do this evening is really talk about the measures of inflation, because I'm sensing from questions that I get from people at work and in the public, there's some confusion about how we measure consumer prices in the US. What are the main measures? And there's actually 2. One is the Consumer Price Index, and the other is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. Right? These are the two primary measures of inflation at the consumer level. And I'm going to start by talking about the most commonly known one, which is the Consumer Price Index, which is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is the oldest price index in the United States. It's been around for quite a long time. The BLS, you might know them as they're the primary purveyors of our employment data in the US. But the other main thing they calculate are measures of price activity through the Consumer Price Index or the CPI. So that's what we tend to see in the press a lot. It tends to be the headline inflation. It's also the primary index that's used for labor contracts. So for example, many of you in the past may have been associated with employers that indexed your wage to the Consumer Price Index. And so your normal pay increase each year would be the Consumer Price Index growth, the inflation measured by the Consumer Price Index, plus maybe a little bit adder on top of that. Most union contracts are connected to the Consumer Price Index. A lot of government programs like your Social Security benefits are indexed to a version of the Consumer Price Index. Okay. Financial instruments. So many of you might have in your portfolio inflation indexed US Treasury bonds. Those bond payments to you are indexed using the Consumer Price Index. And it is such a popular index because the index has many different variations available. So you've got the headline Consumer Price Index, which we call the CPI-U, but you're able to break the Consumer Price Index apart into other component parts, which are highly useful for understanding how inflation is occurring at levels below the overall Consumer Price Index, which incidentally, the Consumer Price Index is actually a survey of prices of urban consumers. Now, the other Consumer Price Index that's used or gets some press, but maybe not as a Consumer Price Index does, but it's just as important, is the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And the BEA are the folks that bring you GDP data. So when there's a release of, what's been happening to US production, what's been happening to US GDP growth, that's being handled by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. But they also produce a Consumer Price Index, again, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. And this is a super important index because it's actually the index the Fed prefers to use when deciding on the appropriate monetary policy for the US. And so, for example, the Federal Reserve has a inflation target of 2% on average over time. For them to know whether or not they're at that 2% target, they rely on the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index to make that determination. It's a little bit more rigid of an index. One thing about it is that it can't be broken apart as easily as a Consumer Price Index is, so you have fewer variations. But it is important because it is the primary measure that the central bank is using for inflation to determine monetary policy. So let me stop. Any questions about that so far? Okay, one thing to recognize is that the Consumer Price Index is typically released several weeks before the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index is. That's part of the reason why the CPI gets a bit more press. And this is rather a fortuitous time to give this presentation because everybody should be aware, I hope, that tomorrow the new CPI will be released for the most recent month, right? And financial markets are probably going to be watching that number pretty closely. So let's talk a little bit about why these two indexes are different, okay? They're both extremely important, but as it turns out, they give slightly different measures of inflation. And in fact, as we're going to discuss here, the reason the central bank prefers the PCEI index, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, is because it turns out to be a more accurate measure of consumer inflation. The CPI tends to overstate inflation. And we're going to talk about why that is, right? So the first thing to realize is both index are based on a basket of goods and services that they're tracking over time. So the CPI is based on a basket of goods and services that are being tracked over time, and they're basically tracking those prices each month. Okay, it's the same for the PCEI. Okay, right, but but how they do it is quite different. So the CPI is a survey of what consumers are buying. Okay, so in other words, it's focused on what we observe consumers are purchasing, whereas the Fed's preferred measure is a survey of what businesses are selling. Now, this is important because in order to create a price index, you have to develop weights. And these, you have to be able to weight the different prices in the index by what people are buying. So you want to know what people are spending their money on, and those expenditure surveys give you the weights that you need to apply to the prices that are going into the index. Okay, well, if you're surveying what consumers are buying versus what businesses are selling, when you compile that survey of expenditures, they're not going to be the same. And so the two indexes are going to different because the spending weights that are being applied to the prices are different. And that's the weight effect. Right. The other difference that's important is the CPI only considers consumer out-of-pocket costs, while the PCEI considers prices related to employer and government-paid health care. So, for example, there are transfer payments going on. The government will sometimes pay for people's health care and such. Those kinds of prices are not in the CPI, but they are in the PCEI. Okay, and that's a scope effect. So in other words, one index is measuring things perhaps a bit more broadly, right? In particular, the personal consumption expenditure index has a slightly broader measure of services that they're tracking, including those services paid by employers or the government. But a really important difference between the two is what we call a substitution effect. As it turns out, the CPI updates its market basket less frequently. So in other words, periodically, both the BLS and the BEA will go out and redo their surveys and reweight and retrack and recalibrate their baskets that they're tracking prices on. It just turns out that the BEA does this more frequently than the CPI does, which means that they're capturing changes in consumer behavior more quickly than the CPI does. So as an example, as the price of meat goes up, as the price of beef goes up, people will shift from buying beef to maybe buying chicken, right? As they try to cope with the price increase of beef. Okay. This is important because that means that the more frequently you can track that kind of substitution effect, the more accurate your price index is. But because the CPI does that less frequently, those substitution effects are not captured as often. The end result of that is that you tend to see over the long run, if you take CPI inflation on an annual basis, less PCEI inflation on an annual basis, if you take the differential and then average it over a long period of time, the CPI tends to run about 0.2 to 0.3% higher than the BEA's measure. Okay, and you notice I have if you look at my slide there, there's a link there to the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank. They have an excellent description in more detail of what the differences between these two measures are. Now, keep in mind, Congress is well aware of this. And in fact, in the 1980s and 1990s, Congress became fairly concerned that because we're using the CPI to index to things like Social Security, and it has a tendency to overstate actual inflation, that it's inflating the cost of these programs. Now, ultimately, they've never done anything about it because it's so politically tricky at this point to shift from the CPI to the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index that they've never done much about it. Okay, But it's also one of the reasons like labor groups are reluctant to shift to something that's more accurate, because by using the CPI, you actually are getting a little bit of a bump over time. Okay. Now, as we're going to talk about in a minute, this bias, this spread between the CPI and the PCEI actually widens the more inflation accelerates. And I'm going to show you a graph that's showing what's happening right now. Because actually the difference between the two and how they're measuring inflation is much wider than 0.2 to 0.3%. And I think a lot of that right now is reflecting that substitution effect. Now, you might ask the question, how come the CPI doesn't fix this issue? Well, actually the CPI is, in other words, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has fixed this problem. And there's actually an alternative consumer price index. It's called the alternative CPI that has, through mathematics, essentially purged itself of this bias. But the one thing about it, it's more complicated to calculate. It's subject to more revisions and is produced more slowly over time. And so as a result, people tend to rely more on the traditional consumer price index. But in fact, there is an alternative to the traditional main headline CPI, the alternative CPI. It just doesn't get much press. And again, it's a little bit harder to use because again, it's slower to come out and it tends to go through a bit more revisions. So let me stop. Any questions about that so far? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's been happening recently. And I want to use the example of gas prices. Okay. And so what this chart is showing you can ignore the colors for a minute, is the price per gallon in the US of regular conventional unleaded, starting with the beginning of 2020, January 2020. Okay. And what you can see here is this time path that we've been observing. You can see, at pre-pandemic, before the pandemic started, it was about $2.50 a gallon. We're now above $4 a gallon. As we were talking just before we started the presentation, if you go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, you can invest in, or if you like, futures contracts for regular unleaded gasoline. And essentially that means that you establish a price now for gasoline that you're going to buy in the future. But because of the way those contracts are structured, the current price of those contracts is considered a market's expectation of where gas prices are going to be in the future. And if you look at those futures prices now, it should suggest that we're going to be well over $4 a gallon all the way through the summer. And so there has been quite a large shift in gasoline prices. But I just want to use the single commodity, the single item that's going to be tracked by both the CPI and the PCEI to talk about what's happened. Right? It's just easier to talk about a single good or service, and then we can move on to something more broad. But you can see that early in the pandemic, we had what was called a negative demand shock. That's what economists call some random event that hits the economy and causes people's demand for goods and services to fall. We can actually see the price going from $2.50 to about $1.65 around about May 2020. And actually, if you looked at very broadly, many types of goods and services, you saw a big decline in price. And so the CPI and the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index were both starting to signal that we might be moving into a period of deflation where you have lots of different prices, not just gasoline prices, falling. Now you see there's a little bit of recovery here as things begin to loosen up a little bit in some states, but generally speaking, gas prices remain permanently depressed until you get to the end of 2020. Then we get into the red area there. And what happened is that finally all of the stimulus dollars that were pouring into the US economy because of this negative demand shock, we had interest rates being pushed way down. We had fiscal stimulus coming out, direct payments to households. right? But you also started to have states loosen up a bit more, and we begin to see the price recover and rise. Okay? And it continues to rise and continues to rise. But at the same time, we're getting some stimulus effects, that positive demand shock from those government stimulus programs. COVID is still raging around the world, and it's still causing great problems on the supply side of the economy. So at the same time, we have the stimulus dollars pushing up demand, which is pushing up price. We're also having suppliers increasingly struggle to meet their supply requirements. And that restriction of supply, especially at the input level, begins to push prices up even more. And certainly that's going to start affecting people who are producing gasoline. So even the refiners are going to start to have problems on the supply side. Well, you get to the yellow area, COVID is still going on. It's still causing supply side shocks. But to make matters worse, we now have the Ukraine war, which in addition to COVID is just another supply side shock. The war has disrupted the supplies of a lot of different things that we'll talk about later. But the sanctions have also been another form of negative supply shock, especially in the case of oil, which is a major component of producing refined gasoline. And so what you're seeing is the inflation that we have right now is being induced by a combination of stimulus dollars coming on top of a series of negative supply shocks. And of course, in the case of the negative supply shocks, these are things that are very difficult to predict. I mean, to be honest, when we were, at the beginning of 2021, I don't think a full scale of invasion of Ukraine was really on anybody's radar. Okay, so let me stop. Any questions about that? Okay, so I couldn't help myself. I had to put in a graph here. I haven't done this for a long time, but I want to talk about, and this, this is a little bit complicated, but I really want to understand why the Fed has such a difficult job of getting inflation under control. And I want to do it again by revisiting this issue of gasoline. So if you look at the first graph on the left, we have price per gallon on the vertical axis, and the quantity of gallons per week on the horizontal axis there. That's Q. And at the start, before the pandemic started, we saw the price per gallon was about $2.50. So what happens is the pandemic hits, there are shutdowns, there's all kinds of negative demand shocks occurring. And so the price of gasoline falls to $1.65. In other words, the demand for gasoline essentially drops down because of these shocks associated with COVID. Okay, and that's what we saw. Okay, go forward several months, we have this monetary and fiscal stimulus. And remember, the goal of the monetary and fiscal stimulus was to reverse the decline in demand to D1, which it did. I mean, and so a lot of people are angry at the central bank. They're mad at the Feds for maybe causing this inflation. But remember, at the time COVID had hit, it was a pretty sharp shock to the economy. There were real concerns about deflation. And so they, essentially what they set up was classic Keynesian economics to re-stimulate the economy. And as we go from D1 to D2, that's where we start to see gas prices rise again, along with the fact that other states were starting to loosen some of the restrictions. Okay. What was also interesting about this too is that, remember, one of the things that happened during the pandemic is people got into camping. And so you started to see a lot of households buy vehicles that probably required a lot of gasoline to either tow or drive. And so we also had some changes in consumer preferences that would have been driving demand. But then we get to the supply side, where the supply side of the economy, the refiners and everybody else, starts to have real problems. So the supply curve, regardless of the price level, shifts back. And so what you get is this kind of Gordian knot of shifting demand curves and shifting supply curves. and $4+ a gallon gasoline. Now, the thing to remember though is that the reason the Fed's job is going to be so difficult is the Fed's main lever are short-term interest rates. That's what they have a lot of influence over. And so what they're going to do, and what they've started to do, is raise short-term interest rates with the hope that as the price of money in the US goes up, economic activity begins to slow. And so what they're hoping to do is to push the demand curve, okay, D2, back down again. But they don't have control over the supply curve. That's something the Fed does not control. So the Fed really only has one lever, and that is to influence the demand side of the economy, right? It can't fix the Ukrainian war, and it can't fix the other issues associated with COVID. It can't ask China to stop having a zero COVID policy, right? It can't fix those things. And so we're left with really only the demand side. And what's interesting, and we'll talk about this in a minute, some economists think that really, and I happen to agree with them, is that if the Fed is successful, they will probably be able to cut the inflation level in half, because we're currently running, this year they expect inflation to be about 6%. If they're successful, they could probably cut that in half. But that remaining inflation is not easy to purge because it's the supply side of the economy, and the Fed simply doesn't have control over that. So let me stop. Any questions about that? Okay. But you know, everybody's saying the Fed's got to fix this. The problem is the Fed can't fix all of it. It's just simply not possible. So this is inflation, what's been occurring just recently. And a couple of things here. The first thing is I just want you to look at the two graphs. The blue line is CPI inflation. It's year over year, same month. So I'm looking at the inflation from 12 months previous compared to the current month, and it's basically a moving 12-month calculation of inflation. And what you can see is that really the CPI and PCEI were moving pretty closely together, measuring very close to each other, which is typical when inflation is relatively low, right? But notice what's happened to the difference between the two as inflation has accelerated. And so there's really quite a large difference now between the headline CPI number and the personal consumption expenditure index number, okay, to the tune of almost 2 percentage points. But what's happening here, a lot of this is this substitution effect that the CPI doesn't necessarily pick up as well. And it's, again, one of the reasons the Fed tends to focus on the PCEI, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's a more accurate measure of what's happening to consumer prices. Now, that being said, if we look at forecasts for 2022 and 2023, and what I like to do is go out and collect forecasts and average them. It kind of is a consensus measure of what people think is going to happen. This year, it's going to be about 6%. And notice next year, it'll be 2023, it'll be about 3%. And most of this reduction, people are expecting this to occur because of the central bank raising rates, which should suggest that the demand side is contributing to about half of the accelerated inflation we're having. And the other half is probably supply restrictions that, again, are not easy to resolve. But what's interesting, though, is you can see, again, the forecast for 2022 for the PCEI is, again, almost 2 percentage points different. So, you know, as you read the press and you hear about things, just keep in mind that these numbers look very different. It's not because of some flaw or problem. It simply reflects the way these indexes are constructed. Stop. Questions about that? Okay. The other thing I want to point out is that notice how the graph that I showed you earlier, the time series graph with the price of gasoline, well, it looks a lot like the time path that you're seeing here. And that's because energy prices still have a heavy influence on the overall rate of inflation, right? And we're going to look at individual commodities in just a bit, but really we have a two-step thing here. So you can see again, we're in this period early on where we're almost looking at a deflationary period. The stimulus dollars start to kick in, and so we get COVID is resilient. China has a zero COVID policy. The monetary and fiscal stimulus with supply constraints are kicking in. But we also have some other odd things. Unfortunately, the last 2 years have sort of been watching the plagues of Egypt. We had the heat dome and drought, which actually also exacerbated inflation, right? Because it created food problems. We had very poor production levels of a lot of foodstuffs because of the heat dome. Okay, then things sort of ease up, and then we get another step. Well, again, COVID is back. China still has a zero COVID policy. And also what exacerbated things here was China also went through an energy policy where in order for the provinces to meet emission targets from the central government, they decided to switch off the power periodically. And to do that, that meant that, essentially, if you're switching off the power, all of the suppliers that operated out of China couldn't run their factories. In addition, I was told that, and read that China got into a trade conflict with Australia, and suddenly coal supplies were highly restricted in China because there were fewer amount of coal coming out of Australia. That also caused some problems with energy production, which meant that the production of goods and services also became constrained. And then, of course, we've got Ukraine. There's disruptions to oil, natural gas, and wheat occurring. I didn't know this until I talked to a farmer in the Palouse, but apparently Ukraine contributes about 30% of the global supply of wheat. They're a big producer of wheat. And so with them offline, it has huge implications for foodstuff prices. Stop. Any questions about that? Okay. Now, I want to spend some time on this graph because it's really kind of interesting. One of the advantages of the consumer price index, even though it maybe is a slightly biased measure of inflation, it's an extremely flexible index for breaking apart and looking at what's happening to the prices of the component parts that go into it. It's much harder to do that with the PCEI. And so what I'm looking at here is what is the year-over-year change, same month. So I'm looking at May 2020 versus May 2019. What was the change in prices or inflation for various types of components? So you have all items. This is the all item CPI, so everything, the headline number. Gasoline, used cars and trucks, lodging away from home. These are subcategories of prices that they're tracking inside the consumer price index. So I'm looking basically between May 2019 and May 2020 versus March 2021 and March 2022. That's the black. And you can see how quickly things swung in terms of prices. So early in the pandemic, we saw gasoline prices fall a lot. We talked about that earlier. Used cars and trucks, did really not much change. Lodging away from home, of course, a lot of people stopped going out, restaurants closed. There was a 15% decline in the prices associated with lodging away from home. Airline fares, huge decline. Car and truck rental. You did have some things increasing like beef and veal, maybe because a lot of people started to eat at home more. Poultry, this kind of thing. Apparel went way down. Retailers had a pretty hard time, so there were a lot of discounting that was going on. But in May 2020, the bias was towards a deflationary period. So in steps the government, but we get stimulus, but we also have problems with Omicron, the supply chain issues that we've talked about, and suddenly you see a big reversal in what's been happening with prices. And in particular, I want to talk about gasoline, because gasoline prices have a big influence on what happens to the direction of the consumer price index, or for that matter, even the PCEI. So they declined 34%, but now over the last year, they're up almost 50%. Okay, that's going to push the CPI higher, right? Used cars and trucks. Well, as it turns out that a lot of people found themselves in situations where they couldn't use public transportation anymore. And so there was a huge demand for used cars and trucks, up 35%, which is really kind of a giant change. Okay. Lodging away from home, people are traveling again. People in the hotel, leisure and hospitality industry are now in a position where they can raise price again. Right. But keep in mind, in some of these industries too, they're having to raise price in part because they're also facing labor shortages, and they're having to raise wages, and they're going to try to probably pass as much as they can on to consumers, and that's going to exacerbate some price inflation as well. Okay, one of the things I really want to talk about though is this category called fats and oils. And this is going to kind of bring home the global problem with inflation. And keep in mind, that is a big problem right now, is that we're having not just a problem of inflation in the US, it's a global inflation environment, right? And it's creating great social unrest in a lot of places. And this is a sunflower, okay? And it turns out not only has the Ukraine war disrupted wheat and the oil market, but the Ukraine is a major producer of sunflower oil. And it turns out in many parts of the world, sunflower oil is a major form of cooking oil. And right now, I mean, we see that it's gone up 15% in the US, right, at the consumer level. But in other parts of the world, the disruption, I mean, they can't even get it. And so in a lot of countries, assuming you can even get sunflower oil, you might be paying double what you were paying before, assuming you can get it on the official market. And one of the problems with official price indexes is they do not necessarily take into account the prices you're paying on the gray market. And so in some countries, as families try to get sunflower oil, maybe they're having to go to the gray market. That is the market outside of the official markets that you and I would participate in every day. If the CPI was able to take into account those gray markets, say a consumer price index in another country, inflation might be much higher than what's even being currently recorded, because the prices in those gray markets are going to reflect market clearing prices that maybe aren't being charged by official vendors in the stores. But if you go to a lot of countries right now, there's actually social unrest because of the inability to get sunflower oil. Now, as you would imagine, we talked about the substitution bias earlier, and not just in the US, but other countries as well. People are trying to move to other substitutes for sunflower oil. But guess what? All that does is push up the price of those alternative oils sooner or later. So it's a big problem. One of the areas globally, and I was reading an article about this today, is where you have a lot of food insecurity is sub-Saharan Africa. So you can go to places like Iraq, the Middle East, but in particular, sub-Saharan Africa has very poor food security, and the disruptions to the food chain that has produced all of this inflation is really causing great problems for those folks. And again, from a governance point of view, you have to worry about political instability because of it. Let me stop. Any questions about that? Okay.
Grant, I have a question. In these calculations, when you talk about food insecurity in other countries and other parts of the world, is climate change factored into any of these calculations, or is that irrelevant to these calculations?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, there's a lot of people looking at how climate change is going to affect food production. And it turns out that a lot of places that have food insecurity now, climate change will make it worse. Okay. And so what that means then is if you're going to measure prices in those areas, is the prices, you know, you're probably going to see accelerating prices because of not only the events that we're seeing now, but because climate change could also change supplies in a way that you see even higher prices. But here's the tricky part of it is that again, in a lot of these places, there's a gray market for these products, and the gray market price might be even noticeably higher than what you're seeing in official markets. And so it's just, I think, useful to point out that as we deal with, you know, COVID, war, climate change, the consumer price index may not be fully capturing the pain that some consumers are feeling in certain countries. And remember, when I talk about food security, it's kind of interesting. A few years ago, economists really looked at this issue of food security, and it turns out that food security is more complicated than just the ability to grow your own food. It turns out a lot of food security comes from just having the income to bring in the food that you need. And so the problem with a lot of regions in the world is that climate change will diminish their ability to grow the food they do now, but it also may negatively impact their incomes, which also makes it difficult for them to, or harder for them to afford food that's grown someplace else. Does that answer your question, Dave? Okay. So really, I think more succinctly, what consumer price indexes, whether it's here or some other country, price indexes are really measuring of, you know, what I would call official prices. It's not necessarily capturing gray market prices that might start to materialize when you see shortages in the official markets. Now, the other thing that's really been in the news a lot, and some of you may have seen these, is baby formula. And actually, that's a big deal. So, you know, this is a big category called baby food, and here it's 11%. But here's the interesting thing: in a lot of places in the U.S., there's a massive shortage of baby formula. And as it turns out, there's some reasons for that. In the US in particular, one of the major producers, because there's only, you know, you have a few producers that kind of dominate the market. One of those major producers had some problems at one of its plants, and they had to shut it down. And that took a lot of supply off the market. And so what's happening is if you go into stores in various places in the US, you'll find the shelves of baby formula, you know, at least half or more empty. And they've started restricting the amount of baby formula that people can buy. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you really, you know, in the theory of markets, you know, the official price should be going up to clear the market so you don't see shortages. And so the question I ask you is, why might not producers be allowing the price to rise to clear the market so you don't have a shortage? And I think I have an answer for it, and it's a rational choice on the part of producers, but theoretically, you know, free markets should clear with a market clearing price. So why would producers be reluctant to allow that market clearing price? It's a quiz question. See if any people are still tracking this late in the evening. Well, it turns out, I'll give you the answer. It turns out that there's a thing in economics we call reputation risk. And it may be a very good idea for the producers of baby formula not to set a true market clearing price. For, you know, first off, it's a real image problem. You risk your reputation as being a price gouger. And maybe that the situation of shortages and the pressure that puts on you is not as bad as being accused of allowing a market clearing price that just seems shockingly high. One of the things that can happen too in those situations is that Congress can get involved, and I'm pretty sure most producers would like to avoid that. And so one of the things perhaps creating shortages in official markets is you have producers worried about reputation risk and reluctant to really set a new market clearing price. And so that reluctance then does create a shortage problem. And again, in other countries, that what you'll see is a gray market develop, though, to try to cover that shortage at a price that's much higher than what you would have to pay in the official market. So again, let me stop. Any questions so far about this? Okay. A couple other things back to Dave's question about things like climate change and so forth. One of the markets that could be in for some big changes in the future, and I hate to say it, is coffee. Coffee prices have gone way up, but climate change is predicted to be pretty hot, is going to be pretty hard for some major coffee growing regions potentially. So that's going to be something that I think a lot of people are keeping their eye on. You know, the wheat market, we talked about wheat going through a lot of turmoil. We had the heat dome. Now we've got the war in the Ukraine. So flour and prepared flour mixes. This may be a market that doesn't recover very quickly, especially if the Ukraine war drags on. And remember, even if the war ends, there's a lot of destruction in the Ukraine. It's going to be very hard for them to get up to speed on production super quickly. And so we do have some markets here that are likely in a situation where they're going to have a lot of dislocation over time. It may be difficult to get inflation under control in some of these markets, but the one thing I would like to say, and this is something that people do get a little bit confused about, even if the central bank is successful in reducing the rate of inflation, the jump in the price level that you're seeing in many of these areas won't necessarily subside. So they can slow the rate of growth of prices, but the price level will likely be higher permanently for a lot of these categories. Right? And that's the one thing that I think a lot of people need to think about is that, you know, wages and prices historically have been very rigid in the downward direction unless you have a severe economic shock. So this new inflation has probably permanently increased the price of a lot of goods and services, even if the Fed can slow the rate of growth back down to their 2% target. And so this is the last slide, I promise. Now, this is a little bit harder to describe, but one of the things that the central bank really focuses on when they look at inflation is not just what's happening to current inflation, but they really care about what's called inflation expectations. And so it turns out that a lot of inflation can be self-perpetuating if people expect high inflation in the future. So for example, if I'm a business or a worker and I begin to think inflation is going to be high no matter what going out to the future, I may start to demand accelerated wage increases, or as a producer, I might start to demand accelerated price levels now to try to beat that expectation in the future, get ahead of it. But what that does is just continue to put upward pressure on inflation and kind of get you in the risk of a long-term inflation spiral. So the central bank has a lot of different measures of future inflation expectations. And this is one calculated by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. It's sort of akin to the yield curve that you might see for US Treasury securities. But it's basically telling you and what they do is they look at inflation surveys. They survey people about what they think about inflation. They have some other kinds of things they look at, and they all put this in a mathematical model, which I won't bore you with. But they can essentially estimate over the next 120 months, which is 10 years, what is the average expected inflation over that period? So if we go out 60 months, what this curve is telling you is, so if you go back to April 2021, right, the markets, you know, the kind of the public's expectation of inflation the average inflation rate over the next 5 years was going to be 2.2%. And keep in mind, the average inflation rate this is capturing is as measured by the Consumer Price Index. And so remember, if this is 2.2% and the bias is about 0.2%, that means that they're going to be pretty close to their target of 2% as measured by the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. So go forward to the current period, people's expectation for inflation over the next 5 years has gradually risen, and it's now about 2.5% on average over the next 5 years. Okay. So one of the things that I think has caused the central bank to move is the fact that this black line has been gradually shifting up to the blue line, to the red line. And so what we're seeing is a subtle increase in long-term inflation expectations, and the Fed wants to get that under control, because at 2.4% average inflation in the long run, that puts them above target in the long run. If you take into account the bias in the Consumer Price Index, which these curves reflect. And so again, one of the reasons the Fed decided to move so aggressively is they saw some creeping up of these long-term expectations. And if this starts to occur, what happens is it means that people no longer believe in your 2% target. Your target is becoming unanchored. And if you don't arrest that quickly, you may never be able to get it back in any kind of reasonable period of time. So part of the Fed's desire to, need to move so quickly, not just the Fed, but also the Bank of Canada and other central banks, is this concern over inflation expectations over time in the long run. So with that, and again, this is just talking about the bias in the index versus the Fed's target. But with that, any questions?
No, I don't see any. Chris, do you see any questions in the Q&A at this stage?
I don't. I have a couple of areas, not really questions, but kind of areas that I'd like to inquire about.
Shoot.
Let me interject, Chris, to the audience. Now is the time for questions. And if you have not done so, please submit your questions via the Q&A features specified at the opening of tonight's forum. Chris and I will alternate your questions as they come in. So go ahead, Chris. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure, no problem. I was out walking my dog this morning and heard an NPR story and about the components of price increases. So I did a little research today and came up with an interesting point, and I guess I'd like some feedback on it. And this is a guy from the, Economic Policy Institute, who studied the components of price increases and compared the average, a 40-year average, with what's happened in the last couple of years. And he said over the 40-year average, the growth in unit prices in the non-financial corporate sector were composed of 61.8% were driven by labor costs, 26.8% non-labor input costs, and corporate profits were 11.4%. But in the last 2 years, it's dramatically changed. And the labor component of price increases was 8%, non-labor input costs 38.3%, but corporate profits 53.9% of the accounted for 53.9% of the price increases. And I've seen that in looking at the oil companies' profits are gigantic. And I guess I'd like some commentary, what your thoughts on that is. Are we really seeing the corporations using this situation to dramatically increase their profits?
Well, it's a good question. And actually, so one of the things that can make inflation potentially worse is market power. And, you know, there's a lot of markets in the United States. We talk about, you know, people sometimes confuse free markets with competitive markets, and free does not mean competitive. And the reality is if you look at a lot of markets in the United States, they're dominated by a few large producers. And certainly gasoline would be one of those, right? And so you have a few large producers producing a product that people really need, right? And it's just between the market power and the fact that what we say is the demand is inelastic, it's not very price sensitive, it definitely gives them room to raise price to clear the market, right? I mean, it just does. And, you know, the long-term solution to that is maybe to some extent to reinvigorate antitrust in the US, which has been very not vigorous for the last 40 years, really, across administrations. That's not a political statement. I mean, the reality is it really starting from really, from the Reagan administration forward, and there's been both Democratic and Republican administrations, we haven't had very vigorous antitrust enforcement. And so one of the things that could come out of this crisis is to look at that again and say, you know, is the market power we've allowed firms to accumulate, has it made maybe the inflation situation worse? But the combination of market power with what we call inelastic demand, meaning people essentially view it as a critical good or service, I mean, it definitely gives room for companies to raise price to cover costs and profits, and, you know, earn profits and also cover their own rising costs.
Do you see any movement towards something like an excess profits tax?
Not a chance. I don't see any movement towards that. You know, I just don't. I mean, and, you know, the reality is, whether you agree with it or not, the country's politics are so fragmented right now. I just don't think you can get there. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I mean, at this point, even changing the top marginal tax rate a little bit is incredibly difficult. To come up with something like this in our fractured political environment, that what you're suggesting, I think would be, you know, very difficult to do.
Grant, we have a question from the audience. I need to put my glasses on because the print size in the chat is microscopic. India and Southeast Asia appear to be very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and they have very large populations. How will this impact the global economy?
So, yeah, there's been, again, economists have really been looking at this, demographers, climate scientists. There's a lot of people looking at this issue because if you look at places like India, Bangladesh, I mean, a lot of island nations are in fact very at risk to this. Okay, so one of the things that might actually do, and this is, you know, and I actually think the U.S. military has also been looking at this. And the truth is, the military has been thinking about climate change for quite a while. If you just put aside politics and all that, they have actually been looking at this. And one of the things that they worry about are mass migrations. And that's one of the things that, you know, we're frustrated now, I think, in America and other parts of the world about migrants, you know, large movements of migrants, and how it affects us culturally and how it affects us economically. But if the predictions of climate change are correct, you should expect more pressure, more people trying to migrate, not only within their countries, but across countries' borders to try to escape the effects, the worst effects of climate change. So what it's going to do is, again, make the migratory issue of people, I think, even more contentious, more difficult to handle, because it'll be more people. It's one of the things that I think a lot of people who are looking at climate change and the effects of it, it's one of the big topic areas.
Chris?
Sure. One of the things in preparing for this today, I was thinking, are there any positive potential impacts from inflation? Are there anything? Is there a bright side at all to any of this?
Well,
one of the things that we've been following here in PEG is housing, and the housing prices are, just through the roof, making it very difficult. do you see that rising interest rates might have some impact on lowering housing prices?
It will. I don't, I don't think housing prices will necessarily go through the correction that we saw in 2008, 2009, and 2010. That the Great Recession adjustment, because part of the reason home prices are so high right now, especially in our region, is you have a lot of people moving here, and you didn't have a lot of building going on leading up to that in-migration. And you've got low interest rates, which is also probably pushing up demand as well. Yes, the rise in interest rates will probably slow the housing market. Okay. But the problem is the rise in interest rates might slow price gains, but it also increases your interest payments when you buy a house. And so there's some offsetting effects there that may not make it any better for people who were born and raised here and trying to find a house, right? Who, born, raised, started their work life here and are trying to buy a house. I think it's still going to be pretty tough. The other issue that's not going to necessarily go away because interest rates go up are people moving to our region. And if you look at a map of the U.S., there's a big internal migration going on in the U.S. There's a whole bunch of people moving to the West. There's a whole bunch of people moving to Texas and the Southeast, and maybe a little bit to the Northeast. But there's a big internal migration going on. And if you look at where housing prices are really hot, turns out it's strongly connected to where people are moving to. And so that's going to limit, I think, the effect that interest rate increases have on the price side of housing.
Brent, when do you think, if you had I know you don't have a crystal ball, but if your best estimate on when the pendulum might start to slow down and the high inflation rates moderate, how long in the future is that?
Well, so this is the thing, the Fed is going to act pretty aggressively, but there is a lag between when they do their interest rate increases and when it hits the economy. I mean, I don't think that we're going to start to see inflation get to a more comfortable level, maybe until the second half of 2023.
Wow.
That's my guess. And we were talking about this before everybody joined, but I definitely misjudged inflation. I was one of those economists who misjudged. I was in the Powell camp that I thought it would be much more transitory. I underestimated COVID. How its sticking power. The vaccine hesitancy wasn't something I had forecasted. I thought people would be much more willing to take the vaccines early as they could. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things I misjudged, but I think if you look at the range of things that are causing inflation, I just think it's going to be hard for us to get to a more noticeably comfortable level until the second half of 2023. So we're a year off, I think. And I can't stress this enough. The war in Ukraine has really exacerbated the problem. I mean, it's a major thing that has upset a lot of markets, and the Fed has no control over it. And the more you read about the Ukrainian situation, it's hard to imagine Putin coming around to some sort of negotiated settlement anytime soon. But I would also, Chris, you had asked the question about anything, what's good's going to come out of this. I think in this environment, you could see, again, thinking about that substitution effect. I think for a lot of people, maybe electric cars start to become a viable alternative, right?
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways that electric cars are really going to take off is if gas is really expensive, right? I mean, it's a substitute. And so that's one thing that you could start to see, is that electric cars people become a lot more interested in it. So they're not subject to these oil shocks because of international kinds of things, or, other things that they, it just maybe gives them a bit more insulation from them. So that's one thing you might see. But also, there could be some innovations in how people are surprisingly flexible. You might start to see people start to innovate in terms of, what they're buying, how they're buying. companies might start to, try to come up with some innovative ways to deal with these issues. So there could be some positive that comes out of this, but I would say, because it's so heavily weighted towards energy prices, the inflation we're experiencing, I think this could potentially give a bit of a boost to the EV side, electric vehicle.
Right.
I have another question here from the Q&A. And the question is, aren't current events leading us to conclude that future human health concerns, such as pandemics, will affect prices more than climate?
Well, that's a good question. And, so let me, again, my job at Avista, I have to read lots of different stuff, and the two might not be separate. and that's sort of one of the things that, virologists and climate scientists are starting to talk about, is to what extent is a warming climate going to affect situations like viruses, diseases and viruses and so forth. And so they might not actually be separate things, right? But it is true. What's clear from the pandemic is that, a serious, widespread pandemic is incredibly disruptive, and it has the ability to greatly disrupt price activity, price levels. But again, if it's an increasing phenomenon, pandemics, if it's increasing and it's associated with climate change, then you really are getting whacked twice. The climate change potentially is having all kinds of effect on prices, especially food prices. And then potentially, if that's also going to increase the spread of illness, it's a double potential whammy.
So I have a question, Grant, with all the cataclysmic events that have taken place, like COVID and the war in Ukraine. Have you thought about what potential other large events that that worry you that would exacerbate this problem even more?
Oh yeah, it's like a closet of nightmares. I mean, really, because again, as a forecaster, I have to think about these things. I have to at least say to myself, okay, given the world that we're living in right now and how unsettled everything looks, what are other risks? And so these are these are the risks that I think about. Political instability, including the U.S., is a risk. I think we have a terribly fractured political environment. That's not, again, that's not a political statement. That's observational fact. Things could go wrong with that. But again, as we were talking briefly before the show started, a lot of countries around the world are in the same boat as we are in terms of potential political instability. I mean, instability in countries that you would not historically have expected it are now in a situation where the politics are highly roiled. And I do worry about what the implication of that is. So a recent example is that if Marine Le Pen had won in France, she would have probably taken a very different track on Ukraine and other policy issues than Macron is going. And it would have really roiled things in the EU, but also in lots of different areas that America cares about. Right. So political instability in previously pretty stable countries is something I worry about. So that's definitely it. I also spend a lot of time worrying about Putin and the Ukraine war and what he's prepared or not prepared to do in that situation. Definitely is a bit of an eye opener. I mean, it's somebody who grew up under the shadow of the Cold War, to hear talk again about using nuclear weapons. Even if it's strategic, the fact that they're willing to mention it openly is something I now worry about, because you just don't know, again, to what extent what Putin will do if he's backed into a corner. And the use of a nuclear weapon opens up Pandora's box in many different ways. So, so political instability, the war in the Ukraine are definitely things that I worry about. We also have some other things with nuclear. North Korea continues to march on. Iran, it's not clear how far along they really are, but my guess is they're pretty close, or could be. And so the issue of nuclear use or proliferation is now really pretty strongly on at least my radar and other people's, from what I can read. So
Got another Q&A question here.
Mhm.
Is a services economy subject to price shocks more than an economy that is heavily based on natural resources?
I would say an economy that's historically, countries that are based on natural resources tend to have probably some bigger swings in economic activity, or they can. And to give you an example is, one of the countries I'm quite interested in, I like to follow, or at least try to follow, Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is definitely a natural resource-based economy, primarily oil. And although that's given them a lot of benefits, it greatly exposes them to changes in technology, business cycle events, and so forth. And so, I actually think the US economy is actually pretty well structured compared to an economy that's much more heavily weighted towards resource extraction or commodity-based kinds of things.
Why do you think, another question I have, Grant, is why do you think inflation was so low for so long?
Well, I think really a couple of things. One is something that happened in the 1980s, and that is you had the central bank, not just the US central bank, but lots of central banks began to realize that they were part of the problem and that you shouldn't necessarily accommodate every economic shock by increasing the money supply. And so what you began to see in the 1980s was a change in focus to really making sure that inflation was low and stable in the long run. And what that did is it sort of got most central banks to move towards more transparent monetary policy and a monetary policy that ultimately evolved into a target rate that you could communicate to the public. And what happened is that was pretty successful. And as the central banks, especially the US and Canadian central banks, began to show they were serious about reaching these target inflation rates, whether hinted at or explicitly stated, that began to get people's inflation expectations also under control. And so really through the 1980s and 1990s, central banks really focused on being credible, more transparent, and focusing on getting an inflation rate that was low and stable in the long run. Hence that movement towards, a 2% target in the case of the US and Canada. And, they did it in a way that made people believe, and that credibility changed people's expectations about the future, and that also helped keep inflation under control. But I would say another big factor is the emergence of China. And one of the things the pandemic has taught us, and it certainly taught me, I didn't really fully grasp it, was how important China had become as a low-cost supplier to the world. And so China's great success at being able to produce quickly and at low cost inputs that they could ship around the world also really helped keep inflation under control. Right? And so that's the emergence of China as a major supply producer as part of the supply chain really assisted in that. And so, changes in monetary policy and philosophy, but also the emergence of China as a major supplier, an efficient supplier, I think helped keep prices, pretty low, pretty comfortable for a long time. And it really took a global pandemic to upset that relationship.
Do you see that there'll be any changes? As I know there's political movement to get away from relying so much on China for political reasons and other reasons. Well, are we going to be a higher cost producer as, we move chip production here and other?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult to replicate the cost advantages of China. They had set up, and it was more than just, it turns out it was more than just wages in China that were helping to keep costs down. It was also, they just had set up a pretty efficient system for getting stuff produced, moving it out to ports and then moving it out globally. They just had a very efficient way of doing that, and that helped keep costs low. So if we do reshore a bunch of things, my guess is that it will be higher cost. My guess, in order to be competitive, even at that higher cost, you're probably not going to have a situation where you're going to have the same employment levels that you did in the 1950s or 70s, right? They're going to have to be highly automated, highly efficient factories in order to produce the product in a way that it's still viable from a profitability point of view. The other thing to keep in mind is, and I think it can be done, but it can't. But you're talking about trying to replicate something that China replicated over several decades, and redoing that in the U.S. is going to be hard. It's, you just can't build a chip factory like that, especially with a bunch of supply constraints on top of it. So I think there will be some reshoring, but I still think China will remain a major supplier to the world. I think in particular, the U.S. military certainly has some interest in probably making sure that some things are reshored in a way that they're not completely cut off for some critical supplies for their own operations. I mean, they certainly have a vested interest in this, just like the tech companies do. But again, I don't think we can completely reshore everything. I think one of the beneficiaries of this, though, could be Mexico, because you can reshore to Mexico. You do get some cost advantages from doing that, at least for now. And so I think in terms of reshoring things to North America, I think Mexico might actually benefit in the long run from that too.
Do you think that as China comes out of the COVID crisis, do you think that that would also help alleviate some of the inflation pressures we're having?
Yeah, and the question the U.S. keeps asking, I think U.S., Canada, and other countries in Europe is, when will China give on a zero COVID policy? When will they say, right, this maybe can't work in the long run? Because, I mean, if you read the recent press about what they're doing, these are severe lockdowns. I mean, these are lockdowns, far worse. I mean, Americans, even people who supported the lockdowns would never support this type of lockdown. I mean, it would just be unthinkable. I mean, it'd be social unrest in this country. But even China, even the Chinese citizens are starting to show the strain from this. It's pretty clear that there's a lot of unhappiness. So the answer to that is, if China came back online, it would alleviate a lot of the supply problems that the Fed can't fix. But for this to happen, the Chinese leadership has to say, okay, maybe the zero COVID policy cannot be, but they don't seem to be there yet.
Do you have any long-term concerns about China and the U.S. and the U.S. retaining the world reserve currency status? Do you see?
Yeah. That's a good question. A lot of, and not just China, but a lot of people would like an alternative to the dollar as the reserve currency. But China's not there yet. I just don't think that the yuan or renminbi, however you want to call their currency, I don't think it's there yet as a reserve currency. I think there's still some uncertainties about how China is going to evolve going forward. So I think really the only true reserve currency right now is still going to be the dollar. I mean, the euro, you had the Brexit, you got the Frexit. That was a potential French exit if Le Pen had won. That's got some instability, and the other countries like the Canadian dollar or the Australian dollar, they're not, those countries aren't necessarily big enough to be the reserve currency. So it's going to be the dollar going forward. But when that tipping point is, it's really hard to say. One of the things that makes the dollar the reserve currency is we have such a big liquid government bond market, treasury market, right? And if you go to other countries, Canada, Australia, and even China, either their bond markets aren't big enough or they're just not well developed enough, like in China. And I just should point out to everybody, the fact that we are the reserve currency gives us huge advantages, right? It really allows us to do some things that other countries can't get away with in terms of, fiscal policy and such, borrowing and that kind of thing. So it'll be a sad day when we're not the reserve currency, unless it's some tremendous innovation that occurs that really benefits us in terms of some sort of substitute reserve currency.
Do you think that could happen with things like Bitcoin?
So yeah. So I have a friend of mine in Europe who's a Bitcoin trader. He's a day trader, and he's just been clobbered, right? And I think, his view when he started trading this currency was, this is going to be the future. This is going to be the currency, and if you're not on board, you're going to be left out. But I've been reading, as much as I can about people who understand it better than I do, because I'm still a little shaky about the underlying value. And some economists have made some really good points. Economists who've studied this is that as a actual money thing, as a medium of exchange, there's a lot to be, there's a lot of bad things about it as a currency, right? Your currency should be stable, a stable medium of exchange, be able to have a pretty stable store of value, as we say in economics. Bitcoin is highly volatile. It's hard to know what the store of value is. And that doesn't make a great currency. And so if Bitcoin is really going to become, or something similar is going to become some kind of global money, it has to be a lot more stable in terms of its value. It has to be. The other thing I would point out about these digital currencies is, when the U.S. finally started to get control of its monetary system, one of the things it did was drive out private money. There's nothing to say that governments can't drive out Bitcoin. I mean, you have to ask the question, are governments going to really allow their national currencies to just be undermined by this particular new form of money? I'm a little suspicious that that's going to happen that easily. But aside, as a source of money, it's highly unstable. The value really makes it a problematic form of money.
I have one more audience question here. Do you see our blocking Russian assets will have other countries like China, which begin to reevaluate the risk and withdraw support for the US dollar?
That's an interesting question. I mean, the problem, China is one of the biggest holders of US treasuries, and they are because of their currency policies. So for them to suddenly, for example, disinvest from US dollars by selling their US treasuries, it's sort of a murder-suicide if you were to do that suddenly. So, I mean, there's going to be some pressure on us. There's going to be some pushback, but I don't necessarily think thinking about the potential catastrophic outcome from the question, I don't necessarily think that's going to occur. We're going to probably take some hits. I mean, we're definitely in a competitive environment with China that's got some punches being thrown. But what the pandemic has shown is we're all closely connected. We need to be a little bit careful how we punish each other, because again, thinking about the murder-suicide kind of analogy, some things you might do to somebody you don't like in terms of a nation that you're struggling with. I mean, it's like you're going to do a murder-suicide, but you start with a suicide first. You have to be extremely careful how you're going to do that. China needs to be very careful. They still need the rest of the world too.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Reshoring to Mexico, would this also address an immigration issue?
It's a good question. I think right now, a lot of the immigration struggles we're having is actually not necessarily from Mexico. It's from other Latin American, Latin American and South American countries that are really falling apart. And in fact, if you look at Mexican immigration to the US, I mean, the relationship has changed a lot. I mean, you're still getting some illegal immigration from Mexico, but I think the bulk of what we're seeing and what's causing a lot of the stress are people coming from countries other than Mexico. Now, it could alleviate it if there were more jobs in Mexico and those immigrants from other Latin American and South American countries decided to stay in Mexico and work those jobs rather than coming to the US. But I'm going to guess that Mexico might have a problem with that too. I think the only way, and this is controversial, I've actually had people yell at me for this a little bit, what's going to solve the immigration problems, the ones we're having currently now, is there has to be a way to stabilize those countries that the folks are coming from. The social conditions in those countries are terrible. They're not coming up here on a whim. They're not risking their life because they're bored one day. It's because the social conditions are so bad. It's extremely dangerous to be in these countries. And until those social conditions change at the source, these people are going to be willing to take incredible risks because the conditions are so bad. And this is what Europe is having to deal with too, from North Africa and now from the Ukraine.
Okay, I think we're close to 8:30. And so, Chris, unless you have any other questions, I think it's time to wrap up.
No other questions here.
Well, Grant, thank you very much for a stimulating presentation and Q&A session. Very insightful and worrisome at some levels, but to be forewarned is to be forearmed. So I guess we have to look at it that way. A lot to chew on here. So thank you again. For the rest of the audience, I just want to remind you that PEG is a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. If you're finding these events helpful, please join us as a member or make a donation to PEG. We are a nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. Please visit our website at pegnow.org. And if you're interested, we really are looking for more members, and we hope you'll give us serious consideration. So on behalf of the PEG board and our membership, we wish to extend again our sincere gratitude to Dr. Grant Forsythe for this important discussion. Thank you also to the audience. You're the reason we do this work. And again, a video of this forum will be posted on PEG's website by the end of the month. We're in the process of scheduling other forums for 2022, and we do hope to have a forum in June on housing and homelessness. So please stay tuned, and you will hear from us soon. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.